20 to 4 in the morning. The snow outside my cabin window turned daylight white for about 3 seconds, followed by a low, heavy thud that rattled the tin mugs off my drying rack. I was running a seasonal marten trapline about 40 kilometers northeast of Terrace, off an old logging spur near the Skeena drainage. Out there in mid-January, you get used to avalanches sliding off the higher ridges, but an avalanche has a buildup. You hear the crack first, then the rumble. This felt like a dead weight dropping straight onto the valley floor. I stood by the window with my parka half-zipped, waiting for a secondary sound. Nothing came. The silence out there in winter is already heavy, but this felt pressurized, like when your ears pop descending into a valley. My initial thought was an unannounced blasting operation from the dormant silver claim 4 miles up the creek, or maybe a hydro transformer failing on the private industrial line running to the old mill site. I threw on my snowshoes, checked the battery on my Garmin inReach, and grabbed my headlamp. If a tree had taken down a power line near the lower drainage, I wanted to know before the freeze got deeper. It took 40 minutes of breaking trail through fresh powder to reach the bench overlooking the creek bed. That was where the smell hit me. It wasn't pine pitch or ozone. It was hot jet fuel and scorched fiberglass, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. Down in the draw, the canopy was sheared clean off over a 200-foot swath. A twin-engine turboprop sat broken in 3 sections across the frozen muskeg. The tail assembly was wedged high in a stand of western hemlock, while the main fuselage had carved a black, smoking trench through 5 feet of snow. The fire was already dying, choked out by the displaced drifts, leaving only smoldering insulation and twisted aluminum. I dropped down the embankment on my backside, yelling out toward the hull. In situations like that, you expect groaning alarms or the high-pitched chirp of an emergency locator transmitter. There wasn't a single tone. The fuselage was dead quiet. I pulled my bandana over my nose and stepped through the split behind the starboard wing. The interior was gutted, seats torn from the floor tracks, but the luggage racks were completely bare. No duffel bags, no coats, no carry-ons. I worked my way toward the cockpit with my light beam cutting through the gray haze. The cockpit glass was blown outward, the instrument panel crushed, but the pilot and co-pilot seats were empty. Not empty as in thrown clear. The 4-point harnesses were neatly buckled flat against the empty seat cushions. I backed out of the fuselage into the snow, my pulse hitting my ears. I pulled out the satellite communicator to trigger the SOS function. The screen flashed an error code I had never seen before. Carrier interference. Uplink rejected. I tried my VHF handheld radio next, switching over to the provincial emergency frequency. The speaker didn't give off standard static. It gave off a rhythmic, mechanical clicking that shifted in tempo every few seconds, sounding less like interference and more like a high-speed relay trying to hand off a connection. That was when I noticed the tracks. Leading away from the shredded nose cone weren't boot prints, but narrow, clean depressions in the snow, spaced perfectly 4 feet apart, moving straight up the steep northern ravine toward the abandoned adit of the old silver mine. No drag marks, no staggering, no sign of anyone struggling through waist-deep drifts without snowshoes. Just deliberate, uniform compressions that had already begun to glaze over with ice. Beside the first set of tracks lay a small, molded plastic aviation tag, clean of soot, stamped with a commercial manifest number, and a destination code for an airfield that had been decommissioned in 1994. I didn't follow the trail. A person who spends years in the bush learns the difference between a situation where someone needs medical aid and a situation where emergency protocols have completely broken down. I turned around and snowshoed the 3 miles back to my camp without stopping. By the time I reached my porch, the overcast sky was beginning to bruise into morning gray. I sat by the wood stove with my radio on the table, listening to that steady, rhythmic clicking cycle through the tiny speaker until 9 in the morning, when it cut off mid-stroke into flat, dead air. 2 days later, a contracted recovery crew came in by helicopter. They never contacted me, never checked the registered cabins in the sector, and didn't stage out of the municipal airstrip in Terrace. By noon the following day, the wreckage had been slung out in heavy cargo nets, the snow churned to mud by tracked skid steers, and the access road regated. The official regional bulletin, released the following week, listed the incident as a controlled disposal of an unairworthy decommissioned airframe during private salvage transport. I gave up the trapline lease that spring. Every now and then, looking at satellite imagery of that drainage, you can still see the pale scar where the trees were leveled, running in a straight line that ends exactly at the sealed entrance of the old mine shaft.